So we've been talking about international security challenges from terrorism and asymmetric warfare to WMD and nuclear strategy. But I want to introduce one that's a little bit different, related to the spread of democracy around the world, and the pace and counterpace and reinvigoration of energy around the advancement of democracy. This isn't a security issue in quite the same way, but when we talk about democratic peace later on, I think it'll become a little bit more clear why the stability and international security that the world faces is linked in part to this idea of democracy and democracy promotion. So I'll begin by noting that democratization has occurred in a series of what we call sort of waves. It's a metaphor. Basically, after the American and French revolutions, there was sort of this introduction of this idea of democracy into the international system, but it was fairly isolated. It was only in a few pockets around the world. And it remained more or less a rare phenomenon up until the end of World War I and then World War II. We saw another sort of wave of democratization where we saw democracy taking hold in Western Europe and other places around the world. And then over the course of the 1970s and into the 1980s and the early 1990s, we saw what's sometimes called a third wave of democratization that sort of swept through Latin America, that swept through Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So that by today, over half of all countries around the world are nominally democratic. And so one way to think about this is just by scoring countries in terms of the extent to which they have democratic institutions, such as regular elections, and have civil rights and civil liberties. So people are able to organize, they have free speech, they're able to have free press and participate in public life. And Freedom House has this freedom in the world measure that they classify countries as free, partly free, or not free. They have a more fine-grained score, and if you go to their website, you can kind of dig into how they code this. But it's essentially institutions like regular elections and the rule of law and civil rights and civil liberties. And what we can see is that a good chunk of the planet has sort of turned to that green, that free category. Mostly Western Europe, North America, South America, Southern Africa, and sort of the Pacific region tends to lean pretty strongly toward free. We've got pockets of what we might call partly free, and then authoritarianism remains relatively strong in the Middle East, in Asia, and in sort of the central and north parts of Africa. So maybe that's not a radically surprising pattern, but in the wake of the Cold War, was that sort of third wave was sort of cresting, there was a sense that the spread of democracy was going to be inevitable, that the Cold War had been a battle between communism, both as sort of an economic system and as a political system of authoritarian control, against the West, which was sort of championing this model of democracy and free markets. And it seemed, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that sort of contest was over and democracies and free markets had won, so much so that Francis Fukuyama famously in a book declares the end of history. And that phrase, end of history, gets sort of regularly panned, and partially deservedly so, but I want to flag sort of the context in which Francis Fukuyama is using this, right? He's not suggesting that stuff is going to stop happening, right? That there's not going to be information and developments and we're not going to have history books advancing. He's thinking about history in a Hegelian sense. And so Hegel argued that history was moved forward by contests of ideas, and you would have a pattern of social and economic and cultural existence, and something would challenge that, and there would be conflict, and that conflict would result in change. The thesis would fight with the antithesis, and out of that would come a synthesis, a new way of existing, a new cultural, economic, social, political mode. And Francis Fukuyama is saying essentially that process of competing ideas driving to new patterns is done, because in Francis Fukuyama's view, there's essentially now a global consensus that no one is seriously arguing that a path to prosperity and stability and long-term sort of human well-being can be achieved any other path than through democracy and a market-based system. And so he argues we've sort of reached the end of history, and it's only a matter of time before markets and democracy sort of triumph everywhere. However, I'm not sure that history, well, actually, I'm very sure history has not borne that out. And so we can kind of look at, again, this is data from Freedom House and their tracking of patterns over time. And they've noted that, since the late 1990s, the advancement of democracy around the world has really stalled out. A number of countries that were more democratic, like Russia, have sort of slid back into maybe that partially free and then eventually into that not free category. For most years, the number of countries that are declining in terms of their democracy score is outpacing, and sometimes far outpacing, the number of countries that are gaining in terms of their democracy score as measured by Freedom House. And part of the story behind this is that very powerful authoritarian states, China, Russia, to a lesser extent Iran, to a lesser extent Venezuela, and lesser extent only in the sense of very powerful, have really viewed the advancement of democracy around the world as a potential threat, and have taken steps both to bolster and protect authoritarian regimes and to try to undercut and erode democracy where they can. And as a result, we've seen this stalling out of democratic progress worldwide. And maybe that's a source of sort of pessimism that sort of things seem like they're eroding, but there's also a real trend against this. And what we're seeing are these, what are sometimes called people power movements, where authoritarian regimes encounter these mass protest movements that oftentimes threaten the very survival of the regime, that push back, that demand reforms. And so we saw this with various different color revolutions. I think the first of these sort of color revolutions was actually not a color, it was a tractor in Serbia, where people drove tractors into the heart of Belgrade and snarled traffic, and essentially shut the city down, were able to force Slobodan Milosevic from power. You had people taking to the streets in Ukraine in the Orange Revolution. You had people taking to the streets in Lebanon in the Cedar Revolution. The Green Revolution in Iran failed, but really stressed the regime. In Pakistan, there was a lawyers' revolution. And again, it's just mass demonstrations pushing back in an authoritarian turn in regimes. Probably the most widespread and dramatic of the dramatic is probably an overstatement, because a lot of these revolutions were incredibly dramatic and were incredibly hard fought. But in 2014-ish, the Arab Spring really saw this people power idea just spreading across the Middle East and North Africa, where in country after country, people took the streets. In some places, they were able to sit down and negotiate with the regime, and achieve concessions and reforms and adjustments to how things operated. In other places, they pressed and the regime broke. So in Tunisia and in Egypt, you see the overthrow of authoritarian regimes by these mass demonstrations. And in some places, you see things descend into chaos and war, as we see in Libya and in Syria and now in Yemen. But it highlights, I think, pretty clearly just the incredible power of people demonstrating against authoritarian regimes. And so it raises a question like, what is making these mass demonstrations so powerful? And I think a big part of the story has got to be social media and access to the internet and access to information that allows for networks of activists to form, and networks of activists to coordinate, and allows for them to gain, to some extent, support from democracies that are maybe pushing at regimes to create space for civil society, to create space for the rule of law, to create space for something that looks like a free and independent press, that can sort of open up a wedge that allows for these demonstrations, that allows for people to mobilize and push back against authoritarian regimes. So there's maybe cause for optimism in all this, but I want to temper that optimism because when we think about the idea of spreading democracy and what can be done to promote the spread of democracy, I mean, certainly you can attempt to spread democracy by force. The United States tried that several times in the last couple of decades. It's succeeded much more, it had much greater success in the wake of World War II. But when you're trying to spread democracy by force, or whether that's an invasion to topple a regime like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or the imposition of sanctions to try to break a regime like the U.S. has tried to do in Cuba and in Iran, and to a lesser extent South Africa in the 1980s. Those strategies have maybe a mixed track record because the regimes that sort of emerge out of them oftentimes face sort of a legitimacy crisis. There's other strategies you can use. You can use engagement strategies where rather than trying to break the regime, you're trying to create that space and that opening for the regime to change. And so that might mean simply just engaging and trying to encourage a regime to be a good and welcome member of the international community, to maybe adopt human rights standards, to stop torturing, to provide something that looks more like the rule of law. Maybe you're fostering civil society. Maybe you are trying to open up the regime to outside sources of information. So the media is not entirely controlled, but there's external information that's getting in. All of these things we think can probably help facilitate the spread of democracy. But as the Arab Spring showed, spreading democracy is oftentimes not enough. One of the things that political scientists who study regime change have found is that democratization occurs a lot. It occurs all over the place. It occurs in rich countries, it occurs in poor countries, it occurs in every region of the world. Democratization is a common phenomenon. Getting democratization to stick is much harder. In fact, if we crunch the numbers from Freedom House and look at what's happened in the wake of the Arab Spring, essentially the Middle East is exactly where it was a decade ago prior to the Arab Spring. Essentially things have sort of reverted back, and any gains that we saw in countries like Egypt have essentially been swallowed up by a return of authoritarian models. And so what we find is that democracy tends to spread and tends to sort of pop up lots of places, but where it actually is able to set down roots and where it's actually able to hang on tends to be countries that are wealthy. And we're not sure exactly why that is. It might be that you need sort of the education levels that come with wealth, right? You need a literate population that's able to engage in sort of public discourse and discussion and follow information, hold leaders to account. Maybe it's that you need a large middle class so that you have a set of population with leisure that's able to sort of participate in civil society and form organizations and maybe play an active role in terms of countering wealthy elites. Maybe it's just that you need a robust welfare state so that when things go really badly, people don't reach that level of desperation where they turn on the regime and overthrow it. We tend to think that democracy does better in regimes that are ethnically homogenous, with a big caveat that that's a maybe. There's a lot you can do in terms of designing political institutions to try to counter that, but depending upon the kind of political institutions that you adopt, deep ethnic social cleavages can really paralyze democracies and create space for authoritarian return. It tends to be helpful to not be rich in lootable resources. So wealth is good. Things like oil wealth tend to be bad. And part of that might go back to that story we told about why it's helpful to be wealthy, right? A large literate population tends to be a prerequisite for gaining wealth through a process of industrialization and post-industrialization. Likewise, a process of industrialization and post-industrialization tends to build up a large middle class. But if you have just massive quantities of oil that you can pull out of the ground and ship out onto international markets and take the cash, that creates a space for the regime to be, well, one, not responsive to the civilian population, because it doesn't require the civilian population to pay taxes or to be engaged in public life in any shape or form. It also creates space for the regime to finance a very large security apparatus that can be used to sort of hold on to power. It tends to be a coercive factor for regimes that are experiencing democratization. Now, if you're a country like Norway that experienced democratization before you got oil, that tends to be less poisonous for democratic institutions, but certainly countries that are oil rich really struggle to be able to democratize and to hold on to democracy. And then the last thing we find is that countries that have managed to sustain democracy tend to be in the West. And we're not, or I should also flag, or have a British colonial legacy. And we're not 100% sure why that is. I mean, some people argue that it's something related to values. Other people would say, oh, that's correlated with wealth. Other people might say, well, if we look at the British colonial legacies, that maybe supports the idea of values, and a British education maybe was useful for the elite that emerged out of colonialism. Or maybe it's the form of post-colonial management or interference. In Africa in particular, Britain tended to coordinate with its former colonies through the Commonwealth. There was sort of this cooperative organization that brought former British colonies together. France took a very different view of how to work with countries in Africa. France, at least through the mid-1980s, very famously said, we don't really care what your regime looks like. We don't care if you're a democracy or an authoritarian regime. Literally, the only thing we care about is if your regime is pro-France. And if a dictator is pro-French, they will get military support and economic support from France. And if a leader or even a democracy, a dictator or democracy, is anti-France, France will put economic pressure on them, and France may even invade and topple them and replace that leader with somebody who's more reliably pro-French. So trying to hold on to some level of control, maybe at the expense of democratization. There's a lot more that's been written on democratization and democratic durability. Just scratching the surface here, but I think it's important to sort of reflect upon what we're seeing is that trend of democratization continues to be a powerful force in international politics. It tends to be oftentimes a disruptive and sometimes destabilizing and sometimes chaotic force in international politics, as we saw with the Arab Spring in Syria and Lebanon and not Lebanon, Libya and Yemen. Ideally, a path towards stabilization would mean figuring out how to get democracy to stick once it's sort of been planted, to get it to take root and be sustainable.